Welcome, everyone. Today, we are doing an intense deep dive into a case that, well, it really stands out in modern criminology. We're talking about the 18-day disappearance and, frankly, miraculous recovery of 4-year-old Cleo Smith. This story absolutely gripped Australia and really the whole world back in late 2021. It wasn't just a media frenzy, though. It turned into this global showcase of focused, intelligence-led police work.
It really did. And, usually when we look at child abduction cases, especially stranger abductions, well, if they go beyond that critical first 48 hours, it's extremely rare for them to end with the child being found safe. So the successful outcome here, that's what makes digging into the sources, understanding how it happened, so valuable.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our mission for you today is to get past the headlines, really understand the mechanics of what happened. We're using sources drawn from, the comprehensive public records, the judicial accounts of the case, and they'll guide us through the complex timeline, the forensic breakthroughs that cracked the case, the huge police operation in Western Australia, and, crucially, the deeply disturbing psychological profile of the man responsible.
Right. The basic facts are pretty straightforward, but they carry immense weight, don't they? 4-year-old Cleo Smith, abducted October 16th, 2021, remote campsite, Gascoyne region of WA. Then found alive and well on November 3rd, inside a locked house in Carnarvon. As criminologists noted at the time, this was just, extremely rare, doesn't quite cover it. And the perpetrator, Terrence Darrell Kelly, was eventually convicted of forcibly taking a child, sentenced to 13 years and 6 months. So, we need to dissect the elements that actually allowed this success.
All right, let's set the scene. Because the location, the sheer isolation, that was a huge factor, especially in the initial chaos. Cleo lived in Carnarvon, a coastal town. Lived there with her mother, Ellie Smith, her stepfather, Jake Glidden, and her little sister. But the abduction itself happened way up north, relatively speaking, at the Blowholes campsite in McLeod. It's about, 80 kilometers north of their home?
That's right, 80 kilometers. They arrived there on the evening of October 15th. Just plain a simple weekend camping trip, Cleo went to bed around 8 p.m. in the family tent. Her mother's last confirmed contact, that was very early the next morning, October 16th. About 2:30 a.m., Cleo woke up, asked for some water, got tucked back in, seemed perfectly normal.
And then, just a few hours later, 6 a.m., the family wakes up, and Cleo's gone. And her sleeping bag, too, a red and gray one, just vanished from the tent. They did a frantic search, obviously, right around the tent first. But I guess they realized pretty quickly she wasn't just hiding or playing, so they called the police. What time was that? 6:03 a.m.?
6:03 a.m., yes. And the response, considering how remote the blowholes are, was actually quite fast. Police dispatched a vehicle within minutes. They were physically at the campsite by 7:10 a.m. But the key thing here, the thing that immediately shifted the perspective, wasn't just that a child was missing, it was the physical evidence. Inside the tent itself, evidence that instantly, clashed with the idea she just wandered off on her own.
Yeah, that detail about the tent zipper seemed small, but it became absolutely defining in those first terrifying hours, didn't it? What exactly did the investigators find there?
Well, Inspector John Monday confirmed it later. The zipper on the tent, it was opened, but only to a length of about 30 centimeters, so roughly 12 inches. And crucially, the opening, the top of that zip, it was positioned higher than a 4-year-old child could realistically reach to unzip it herself from the inside. That immediately suggested someone from the outside, likely an adult, had opened it, reached in, and taken her.
Wow, that specific detail, the height of the zipper opening.
Yeah.
That must have been the moment it shifted from a missing child search, potentially tragic but maybe accidental, to, a presumed abduction, a criminal act. It backs up what her mother said, that desperate certainty. She would never leave us. She would never leave the tent.
Exactly. But, police procedure and public messaging have to be managed carefully. So for the first few days, officially, I think up until October 20th, the police leadership maintained the public stance that it was primarily a search and rescue operation. Acting Deputy Commissioner Darrell Gaunt even stated that claims it was immediately treated as an abduction weren't technically correct.
Why the delay in calling it an abduction publicly? I mean, the zipper evidence seems pretty compelling right from the start. Was it about resource management or avoiding panic?
Probably a combination of both. It speaks to the operational challenges, especially in remote WA. Launching a full-scale abduction task force immediately that commits massive resources, it can absolutely spark panic in the community. So standard procedure is often to exhaust the non-criminal possibilities first, the search and rescue angles, but internally. You can bet the officers on the ground were already working on the assumption of foul play. That zipper detail plus the missing sleeping bag. I mean, a child wandering off wouldn't usually take their sleeping bag, would they? So they were likely holding those two possibilities, search and criminal, in parallel until they could officially escalate and mobilize for the full criminal investigation. And that escalation happened around October 21st. The operational phase officially shifted then. They'd spent nearly a week searching that rugged terrain around the blowholes. Nothing. So police went public, confirming they believed Cleo had been abducted. And that triggered a complete restructuring of the whole investigation.
Right, and this is where Western Australia really threw everything at it, starting with that announcement from Premier Mark McGowan. A huge incentive, a $1 million reward for information leading to Cleo, which is massive. But that scale of reward, it started creating its own set of problems for the investigators, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A reward that large definitely gets the public's attention, galvanizes people to help, which is good, but it also creates, well, let's call it operational friction, noise. Australian media reported exactly what you'd expect, an influx of, let's say, amateur sleuths or even self-styled bounty hunters, suddenly descending on Carnarvon, drawn by that seven-figure sum.
That must have been pure chaos for the actual police work. You've got law enforcement trying to manage a crime scene, control forensic evidence, run a proper investigation, and then the town's flooded with people motivated by money, sometimes even, reportedly, pestering locals for clues. How did the official team handle all that extra noise?
Yeah, it requires a really high degree of control and centralization. You have to filter information ruthlessly. The official police response was Task Force Rhodia, launched by the WA Police Force. And this wasn't just some makeshift group. Task Force Rhodia was a sophisticated multi-agency operation. They brought in specialists from the Australian Federal Police, the AFP. Eventually, it involved more than 100 officers, led by Superintendent Rod Wild. Their job was basically to manage everything. Digital forensics, data analysis, and crucially, vetting the hundreds, maybe thousands, of public tips that Reward generated, sifting the signal from the noise.
Let's focus on Task Force Rhodia's methods for a second, because this is where the modern, sophisticated policing comes in, right? In a remote place like that, what does a task force actually prioritize when the initial physical search turns up nothing?
Well, physical evidence at a remote campsite, especially one exposed to the elements like the blowholes, it degrades quickly. Or might be minimal to begin with, so the focus almost immediately pivots. It shifts to digital footprints and, critically, vehicular movements. Task Force Rhodia would have been deep into data mining, processing phone records, analyzing cell tower pings from the area around the time Cleo went missing, bank transactions maybe, and absolutely crucial, reviewing every scrap of available CCTV footage. Not just from Carnarvon town itself, but all along that 80-kilometer stretch of road leading to the campsite. They weren't just searching the landscape anymore, they were searching vast streams of data.
And there was that other factor, kind of an ironic twist, that actually helped them narrow the search area.
Exactly. The WA police commissioner at the time, Chris Dawson, he pointed this out. Western Australia had those really strict COVID-19 border controls in place back then. Remember how hard it was to get in or out? Well, that made it incredibly difficult for someone to potentially move Cleo interstate without being detected. So it allowed Task Force Rhodia to narrow their search parameters quite significantly. They could operate with a much higher degree of confidence that Cleo, and whoever took her, were likely still somewhere within Western Australia. That let them focus their resources much more effectively within the state, that geographical containment. It definitely boosted the probability of success compared to a typical abduction where state lines are easily crossed.
And that successful containment, that focused effort, leads us right to the breakthrough moment.
Oh, yeah.
After 18 agonizing days, the anxiety was just immense, wasn't it? Nationally, globally even. Here's where it gets really interesting, because where they eventually found Cleo, it was physically shocking, almost unbelievable.
It really was the rarest possible outcome you could imagine. The night of November 3rd, 2021, Cleo was found, alive, and physically well, inside a locked house. And the incredible, almost unbelievable part, that house was located just minutes away from her own family home in Carnarvon, meaning that whole massive search effort, the helicopters, the officers, the media, it had all been circling unknowingly around the abductor's location for nearly 3 weeks.
Wow. Deputy Commissioner Cole Blanche gave the exact timing, didn't he? Police broke into the house at 12:46 a.m., found Cleo in one of the rooms, alone, I think. That image, the police finding her saying, "My name is Cleo." Commissioner Dawson called it one of the most remarkable days in policing in Western Australia. You can understand why.
Absolutely. And that success was, well, it was doubled almost immediately. The alleged perpetrator, Terrence Darrell Kelly, 36 years old, he was taken into custody shortly after. Police stopped a car he was driving nearby, so it was this coordinated action securing Cleo safely and apprehending the suspect without incident.
Okay, but the massive question is how? After 18 days, with the house so close, practically under their noses, What was the specific lead? What piece of forensic evidence finally pointed Task Force Rhodia to that house, gave them enough for a warrant?
Police pointed directly to crucial forensic leads that centered on vehicular movement, specifically information about a car. Remember, they'd made a public plea back on October 25th, asking for anyone who'd seen a specific car. It was spotted driving away from the Blowholes campsite area in the very early hours of October 16th, around the time Cleo disappeared. It seems through really meticulous work reviewing huge amounts of CCTV footage collected over weeks, combining that with mobile phone data analysis focusing on cell tower activity near the campsite around that critical time window. They managed to zero in on Kelly's vehicle, and from there they linked the vehicle to his residence, that house in Carnarvon.
That connection.
Yeah.
Tracing a potentially blurry car sighting at a remote campsite 80 kilometers away, all the way to a specific suburban house, that really shows the power of modern data analysis and digital forensics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Moving way beyond just knocking on doors.
Absolutely. It was that combination, the digital trail plus the specific visual evidence from the public plea that ultimately cracked it. And the impact on the family, well, instantaneous and just overwhelmingly positive. Cleo was reunited with her mom and stepdad later that same day at Carnarvon Hospital for checkups.
And amidst all that relief, that incredible joy, there was that one detail her mother noticed. Something unsettling about Cleo's appearance.
Yes, the sources confirmed that Ellie Smith noticed that Cleo's hair, it had been cut and possibly dyed, or at least altered in color. This is actually, sadly, a known behavioral pattern in some extended stranger abductions. It's often an attempt by the perpetrator to change the victim's appearance, maybe as a crude disguise to make them less recognizable. Or perhaps, particularly in Kelly's very complex case, it might have been tied into his disturbed fantasies, an attempt to assert control or sort of assimilate Cleo into whatever scenario he was playing out in his head.
Right, and bringing this back to the context we started with, the criminology aspect.
Yeah.
This recovery genuinely defied the odds, didn't it?
It absolutely did. Associate Professor Xanthe Mallet, a criminologist who commented on the case, she really emphasized how finding a child safe after that length of time is statistically exceptional. It just doesn't usually happen. She noted the case broke the expected pattern. Most child abductions, especially by strangers, if they end tragically, it happens very quickly, often within hours. The fact that Cleo was held for 18 days, apparently physically unharmed, in a house right there in Carnarvon, minutes from a major police operation, it makes the outcome a significant anomaly. It suggests that while the abduction itself might have been opportunistic, the way she was held, the situation inside that house, must have been complex and highly irregular. So once Cleo was safe, the focus inevitably shifted. From the how of the police operation to the why and who of the perpetrator. Terrence Darrell Kelly was charged very quickly, November 4th, 2021, the day after the rescue.
And he went through the court process, pleaded guilty eventually, to one count of child stealing, forcibly taking a child under 16. That was in January 2022. And then there was a separate guilty plea later on for obstructing police officers during the investigation, I think. Got a fine for that.
That's right. And the whole judicial process concluded in April 2023. He was sentenced in the Perth District Court, 13 years and 6 months in jail, eligible for parole after serving 11 and a half years. And just for completeness, it's worth noting he did appeal that sentence, tried to get it reduced, but that appeal failed in September 2024. But really, to even begin to understand why this crime happened, you have to look at Kelly's background, the trauma that seems to have defined his entire life.
Yeah, let's dive into that, because the sources paint a picture of just profound dysfunction, severe trauma starting really early.
Kelly was born in Wickham, another town in WA. His parents were Indigenous Australians. And his childhood, by all accounts, was marked by frequent violence, alcohol abuse, just instability. He suffered what the court reports termed chronic, severe, and complex trauma, starting basically in infancy. And he was placed into state care at the incredibly young age of 2 years old. That kind of early, severe disruption, it just sets the stage for immense developmental problems down the line.
And the effects showed up early, didn't they? Diagnoses of ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, and then things got really serious around age 12, hospitalized for suicidal thoughts.
Yes. The psychological pressure was clearly immense even then. His behavior worsened, became more antisocial, eventually led to him being expelled from school because of violent incidents, inappropriate behavior. And he did have a criminal history before the Cleo Smith abduction. He'd served time for burglary, aggravated burglary, also got fined for methamphetamine possession. He was actually released from prison back in 2017. And at the time he abducted Cleo, he was living alone in Carnarvon, in his late aunt's public housing property.
And there's that other deeply disturbing connection. the environment he grew up in. He wasn't the only person from that household to commit such a serious crime, was he?
No, and this is deeply unsettling. Kelly was raised, for a time at least, in the same household as another individual, Ashley James Braffo. Braffo was his aunt's biological grandson. Now, Braffo himself was later convicted of the abduction and horrific sexual assault of a 9-year-old girl in Perth. Braffo was actually later murdered in prison in 2023. While Kelly's crime was obviously separate, the fact that two individuals raised in that same profoundly troubled environment went on to commit high-profile child abductions. It really suggests a devastating cycle. Intergenerational trauma, pathology. It's hard to ignore that link.
The court process required a deep dive into his mental state, right?
Yeah.
A pre-sentencing assessment. And the findings were, well, harrowing. They provide a sort of clinical lens on his actions. Can you break down some of those diagnoses?
Yeah, the assessment was stark. It found he had a severely fragile, disturbed, and fragmented identity, which often happens as a result of chronic childhood trauma, you know? The sense of self just fails to come together properly, leads to detachment, instability. Beyond that baseline fragility, he was diagnosed as being detached, antisocial, depressive, and narcissistic. And then the really serious diagnoses on top. A severe personality disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, and complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from that childhood trauma.
That is just a staggering combination of severe mental health issues, paranoid schizophrenia, and narcissism.
Yeah.
How might those conditions manifest in the context of this particular crime, the abduction?
Well, paranoid schizophrenia obviously suggests a potential break from reality, possibly delusional thinking. We don't know the specifics of his delusions, but it's there. The narcissistic and depressive elements, combined with that fragmented identity, it points towards someone likely incapable of forming healthy, stable relationships with other adults. So maybe he sought control, connection, or fulfillment in these deeply inappropriate substitute ways. And that leads us directly to those, well, odd details about his private life that came out. The whole fathering fantasies thing.
Right, the dolls.
Yeah.
That detail really stuck with people, giving this disturbing glimpse into his internal world. The Bratz dolls.
Exactly. He had this large collection, dozens of Bratz dolls, some apparently kept in their original packaging like collector's items. And he wasn't just collecting them privately. He was actively sharing photos, even videos of them online. Now, you couple that fixation with the documented evidence of his fathering fantasies. Remember, he created fake Facebook pages for imaginary children he pretended were his. He even lied to police initially, claiming these fantasy children were real. It suggests he was living in this kind of delusional substitute reality, a world where he could control and, in his mind, nurture these idealized dependent figures, the dolls, the fake children. The Abduction of Cleo. It seems terrifyingly like it might have been an opportunistic, impulsive attempt to make that long-held, deeply disturbed fantasy real, to have a real child in his life under his control.
And the police superintendent, Rod Wild, he characterized the abduction itself as purely opportunistic, didn't he? Kelly had zero prior connection to Cleo or her family. He just happened to be at the Blowholes campsite at the wrong time, saw an opportunity. And given his history, his mental state, he was like this ticking bomb, just waiting for that specific awful opportunity to act out this fantasy.
Precisely. Neighbors in Carnarvon, they described him as very quiet. A bit of an oddball, they said, but not someone they'd ever suspected of being capable of something like this. And that's what's so chilling. His complex profile of the severe mental illness, combined with that opportunistic trigger, made him an almost invisible threat. Living just minutes away, completely undetected, while the biggest search in WA history was unfolding right around him. So if we bring this all together, try to synthesize this deep dive. The Cleo Smith story is, first and foremost, just a remarkable testament to persistence. Police persistence, family hope. It really highlights how incredibly rare a safe recovery is after such a long time. And it wasn't just luck. It was driven by that strategic application of resources, Task Force Rhodia. Their success really depended on moving beyond just searching the ground, leveraging digital forensics, data analysis, and crucially, acting decisively on that subtle but vital forensic lead.
The car sighting.
And we've also spent time looking closely at the perpetrator, Terrence Kelly. His crime was opportunistic, yes, but his capacity to commit it seems clearly built on years and years of that chronic, severe trauma, culminating in this profound psychological fragmentation, these dangerous fantasies. His case is just this tragic illustration, really, of the devastating consequences when severe mental illness, rooted in childhood damage, goes unchecked.
Absolutely. And the lasting lesson here for you, the listener, is really about understanding the sheer sophistication, the resources, the combination of techniques required to achieve these extraordinary against-the-odds results. This was undeniably a win for disciplined, focused, technologically aided police work.
So what does this all mean? Beyond the incredible relief, the pure joy of Cleo's safe return. Maybe the most challenging part of this whole story is grappling with Kelly's diagnosis. That severe personality disorder, the paranoid schizophrenia, the deep complex trauma starting from when he was just 2 years old. You have to wonder. The system, in many ways, failed him long, long before he became an opportunistic abductor.
And given that clear evidence, that documented history of severe disturbance, which seems to have directly fueled his destructive fantasies, it leaves us with a final provocative thought, something for you to really consider. What systemic changes might be needed? In child protection services, in mental health funding, in community care programs? What's required to better identify and maybe provide mandatory intensive intervention for individuals who show these kinds of severe, chronic behavioral precursors before tragedy strikes? How do we ensure that the opportunity for an opportunistic crime like this, born from such deep damage, simply never gets the chance to materialize? That's the heavy question, the burden of knowledge, that this deep dive ultimately leaves with you.